This is the morning of the 9th. Clip put up by Mohammed Abdul Wanaba Lazar. The last word with Lawrence O'Donnell, November the 8th, 2025. Let's have a listen. I don't know if I'm going to play it all. It plays for 26 minutes. I might play half of it, and you'll have it to watch in its entirety. Depends on what I hear.
Last night, Donald Trump went from being a lame duck to being a humiliated duck when voters from coast to coast turned out to vote against Donald Trump and his candidates and his policies in every place and in every way that they could. Donald Trump's explanation today for the Republican wipeout last night is that Donald Trump was not on the ballot. That's what he says. The conservative Wall Street Journal editorial board has written a reply to that under the headline, "Trump really was on the ballot." The Journal editorial says Mr. Trump was on the ballot, not literally, but nonetheless, as the main motivating force behind a dominating Democratic turnout. Winning Democratic candidates for governor in New Jersey and Virginia linked their opponents to Mr. Trump, driving Democratic voters to the polls and erasing the GOP gains in 2024 among Hispanics, Black men, and independents. The result was a much bigger Democratic triumph than polls predicted. The tsunami was big enough that Democrats were able to pick up 13 seats in the Virginia House of Delegates. They'll have 64 seats out of 100, which could give Democrats the chance to redistrict next year to gain congressional seats. And in California, where not a single name was on the ballot, voters stood in long lines to deliver 63% support for Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom's proposal for congressional redistricting in California that could add 4 or 5 seats for the Democrats to the House of Representatives and win control of the House of Representatives for the Democrats in next year's election. Every one of those California votes for that proposition was a vote against Donald Trump, every one of them. The reason no previous president has ever considered pursuing any of the policies Donald Trump has pursued this year is that those policies are obviously politically suicidal. And now we have the proof of that. And Donald Trump's bright idea today, during his politically suicidal government shutdown, is to partially shut down the air traffic control system in this country with the Thanksgiving travel surge approaching. Every day, Donald Trump finds a new way to weaken himself and weaken his party politically while making life in this country worse for millions of Americans. And now he wants to make it much worse for the millions of Americans who hope to go home for Thanksgiving this year.
Honestly,
Ad popped up.
With less than a year into his presidency this time, Donald Trump is now the lamest of lame ducks ever to occupy the presidency. And sinking with him is the lamest group of Republican members of the House and Senate that the country has ever seen. The election returns last night indicate that a year from now, Democrats will win back control of the House of Representatives, and Donald Trump's administration and his incompetent cabinet members will be subject to real investigations of their personal profiteering from government, real investigations of possible abuse of their office, real investigations of an FBI director who uses a government plane for date night. Democratic control of the House of Representatives means that most of the Trump madness can be stopped and in its tracks. And Donald Trump knows that. And so Donald Trump is living in fear tonight of just how bad election night is going to be for him next year. And just 12 hours after Donald Trump's electoral humiliation last night, in the United States Supreme Court this morning, Donald Trump was humiliated again when the Supreme Court, including the justices who Donald Trump appointed, ripped apart the biggest and stupidest policy lie of the Trump second term. At 11:22 a.m., when Neil Katyal rose to address the Supreme Court, the first sentence he spoke contained only 3 words.
This is a tax.
Tariffs are taxes. And there it was. The pure economic truth and policy truth about tariffs that the founders of this government knew, and that every president has known and every member of Congress has known until Donald Trump started lying about tariffs. The Trump tariff enforcers were seated in the front row at the Supreme Court today. Why? To try to intimidate the Supreme Court? The always goofy Howard Lutnick, the most incompetent Commerce Secretary in history, who is always the loudest laugh at every Trump joke, was there in the front row, bringing into the room a mind smaller than the smallest mind on the Supreme Court, and sitting beside him was the Secretary of the Treasury. In our lifetimes, the Secretary of the Treasury has never attended a Supreme Court hearing. The last Secretary of the Treasury known to have attended a Supreme Court hearing was the first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. But that was in 1796. Hamilton attended a Supreme Court hearing only when he was a former Secretary of the Treasury, the year that he attended that hearing. And so it is entirely possible that no currently serving Secretary of the Treasury has ever attended a Supreme Court hearing until the relentlessly ineffectual Scott Bessent, who appears to believe that the most important thing about being a Treasury Secretary is dressing the part, while being willing to say the most ridiculously false things ever said about tariffs by a Treasury Secretary. Donald Trump himself had been threatening to attend the Supreme Court hearing, presumably as some kind of intimidation tactic. But he chose in the end to send his completely unintimidating court jesters instead. Donald Trump's lawyer, arguing in favor of his illegal and unconstitutional tariffs today, had a much more difficult time than the Trump tariff enablers do when they appear in very friendly TV interviews that they submit to. The Treasury Secretary and the Commerce Secretary have an open invitation to come on this program and discuss tariffs for the full hour or any amount of time that they choose. But they haven't shown up. Today, they had to sit there silently when Neil Katyal said tariffs are taxes. And they had to sit there silently for all 2 hours and 40 minutes in which Donald Trump's lawyer never said that tariffs are not taxes. He didn't try to make that impossible point. It was simply an accepted fact of the case by all of the justices. Tariffs are taxes. 3 minutes after Neil Katyal's first sentence saying tariffs are taxes, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court said, quote, "The tariffs are a tax," end quote. That is how fully accepted that fact was during this argument. Chief Justice Roberts said, yes, sure, the tariffs are a tax, and that's a core power of Congress. Yes, sure. Not a single Supreme Court justice disagreed with the Chief or Neil Katyal about that. Tariffs are taxes is the single shortest sentence that exposes the lie of the Trump tariffs, which Donald Trump has claimed are paid by foreign countries. Donald Trump's lawyer, the Solicitor General, didn't dare try to tell that lie to the Supreme Court today. Donald Trump's lawyer could not refute one word of Neil Katyal's exquisite opening 4 sentences in his brilliant argument today.
Tariffs are taxes. They take dollars from Americans' pockets and deposit them in the U.S. Treasury. Our founders gave that taxing power to Congress alone. Yet here the president bypassed Congress and imposed one of the largest tax increases in our lifetimes.
Dollars from Americans' pockets. This is what Donald Trump has done. He has imposed one of the largest tax increases in our lifetimes by stealing a power that the founders explicitly gave to Congress alone. Not one word of that was disputed in any way before the Supreme Court today. Chief Justice Roberts made it very clear who pays the Trump tariffs in his first questions to Donald Trump's Solicitor General. Chief Justice Roberts said this about the Trump tariffs. Quote, "The vehicle is imposition of taxes on Americans, and that has always been the core power of Congress." The Supreme Court has spoken. Americans pay the Trump tariffs. Justice Sotomayor interrupted Donald Trump's Solicitor General early in his argument with a line a lawyer never wants to hear from a Supreme Court justice: "I just don't understand this argument."
Swap your bed.
It's not an article. It's a congressional power, not a presidential power to tax. And you want to say tariffs are not taxes, but that's exactly what they are. They're generating money from American citizens, revenue. And you say it's incidental to the regulatory purpose. But I don't see how a quota is equivalent to revenue raising. A quota sets a limit to what you can import in, but it doesn't generate revenue.
There were no sharp disagreements among the justices. Not a single justice disagreed with Justice Sotomayor's statement that tariffs are paid by American citizens. The Solicitor General tried to argue that a federal law that gives the president an emergency authority to regulate some aspects of international trade gives Donald Trump unlimited power to impose tariffs. Justice Sotomayor pointed out that Congress never uses the word regulate to mean tax. And Neil Katyal made this point about the word regulate.
The word regulate is the words regulate importation. The word regulate has never been used. The Congress uses the term 1,499 times. We got about that number of hits when we looked at it. And maybe there's some double counting, but it is never used even once to impose taxes or revenue raising.
The Trump-appointed Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch showed how a newly invented presidential tariff power could become a nightmare scenario for Republicans.
Could the president impose a 50% tariff on gas-powered cars and auto parts to deal with the unusual and extraordinary threat from abroad of climate change?
It's very likely that can be done. Very likely.
I think that has to be the logic of your view.
Yeah.
Yes, that is the logic of his view. That is exactly what the Trump argument is.
I gotta stop it at the 12-minute. Too bad Lawrence O'Donnell isn't running for president. He sure looks presidential, and he sure sounds presidential, other than that babbling idiot that we have in the White House. And he's so fucking stupid. He doesn't understand that tariffs are taxes. Good news is the Supreme Court does. And they're going to be paying back a whole lot of money to the people they've already taxed. Guy's a moron. You hear that, Trump? You're a moron. I'll attach the link. Watch the rest of the clip. And thanks for listening.